I think that, got it. I think that's kind of a guiding principle for some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about. You can't have a role as a university in supporting Indigenous languages if you are not making space for Indigenous peoples to lead that work. And there are different ways you can do it, but basically sharing university resources like physical space, human resources, funds, that's what I'm talking about. And that can't happen without Indigenous peoples and communities leading the way. So why is this important? Well, Belinda Daniels and I have recently published an article. And in that article, we say that threats to Indigenous languages are the most urgent language problem of our time. So that's my starting point. I think this is a problem that, and I think many of the people in this group are interested in languages, language education, possibly see themselves as applied linguists. I think that this is the biggest language problem of our time. And so it deserves the attention of people who have expertise in the area of languages. It deserves the attention of universities, which are meant to be places where knowledge is exchanged. And Indigenous knowledge is part of legitimate knowledge that should be shared within university settings. Indigenous people in the territory that is currently known as Canada are fighting for the survival of their languages, and partners and allies and accomplices need to do more to remove systemic barriers in these places. So I want to tell you a little bit about some people who teach me. And so this isn't a slide of, oh, these are my Indigenous friends, but I do want to acknowledge that a lot of what I share here and any kind of knowledge that I might have is really informed by people who are generous with me. And I don't have expertise in Indigenous language activism. I don't have expertise in the area of Indigenous languages. And this, in a lot of ways, this talk feels really tentative. I listen to others and I read what I can, but the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know what I don't know. So there are lots of Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks who could give this presentation, but I just want to share a little bit about what I know. So I'll tell you a little bit about my friend Belinda. I collaborate with her a lot. She is a Cree language activist at University of Victoria, and she recently completed her PhD at the University of Saskatchewan. We do research projects together and we write together. My friend Russ Fayant is Michif from the Capel Valley. He and I published together and we've done some research. He helped me write the abstract for this presentation because I wanted to make sure that I got it right. So I reached out to him and asked him for some help in making sure that I wrote it in a good way. My friend Cheryl Cusance is a community member from Kisakus First Nation. I've been fortunate enough to work with her for a few years before COVID on the topic of Anishinaabe language revitalization. I have some colleagues at the U of R in my faculty, Doctors Analia King and Melanie Bryce, who work in the area of Indigenous language revitalization. I'm really lucky that the university where I work has a federated college called First Nations University of Canada, and there are lots of students and staff and faculty members there that I am fortunate enough to work with and learn from. And then my colleague, she's retired now, Dr. Valerie Mulholland, is a settler academic, but Val is probably like a role model to me when it comes to figuring out how to make spaces in university. I learned very early on when I started as a professor at the U of R that Val is a workhorse, and her motto is sort of when she's asked to help, she helps. And that extends to the kind of partnerships and work that she does in supporting places like Gabriel Dumont Institute, First Nations University. And I learned a lot from her. If someone asks and you have time to give, you give it. And that's kind of a guiding principle, I guess, in the things that I'm going to share. So those are people who inform me, who teach me, who correct me when I make mistakes. And I wanted you to know who they are as I move into talking to you. And another thing I wanted to just bring to your attention is that this is the article that Belinda and I have recently published in the Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics. And a lot of the ideas that are in what I'm talking to you about today are also in this open access article that you could all click on and cite, because that would help Belinda in her tenure track position. Okay. This is actually Belinda's uncle. His name is Willie Ermine, and he is a Cree knowledge keeper from Sturgeon Lake First Nation, which is located sort of northwest of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. And he lives and works in his community now, but he also worked as a professor for a portion of his life. And there's an article that he wrote in 2007 that's really a good one if you want to read about how settlers and Indigenous peoples can be together in good ways. So he uses an idea called the ethical space of engagement. And basically it's the space between any two entities. But in this case, I'm talking about between Indigenous peoples and settler Canadian institutions. And that space offers opportunities to engage differently with one another. And we can learn to meet in that space, but it takes a lot of effort over a long period of time. But in doing so, we have the possibility to create a level playing field, and a spirit of cooperation is required. Those kind of words, the idea of having a spirit of cooperation, there are things that I try to keep in the back of my head as I try to figure out ways to be a good accomplice in universities. So I'm going to talk to you about some really boring parts of academic jobs that all of you are familiar with, but they are spaces that can actually be really productive in terms of making space for Indigenous language activists. So the idea of committee work, which is something that we do a lot of, but this is something that I learned from Val. When I am asked to be on things like job search committees or tenure and promotion committees, things that I get asked to do for First Nations University, I say yes. When they ask me to support them in things like developing programs or moving programs through governance structures, I say yes, because those are areas where I can create change without stepping on toes, right? I can create change without trying to lead the change. So I say yes to those things. I make myself available. Strategic plans are things that people need to pay more attention to, because if you can insert something like statements about commitment to Indigenous languages or improving conditions for Indigenous graduate students, once those are embedded in strategic plans for faculties and universities, that opens up mechanisms for universities to spend money, basically. And you can say things like, this is an action that supports item whatever in the strategic plan. So these are some ways that I try to, I guess, change structures or cut through red tape. And again, I've learned this from watching others do it, but university governance is not easily changed structures, but there are things that once you've been working in universities for a while, you have expertise and knowledge about. And this is something that I try to use to my advantage when I'm trying to create spaces. A lot of what I do has to do with relationships that I have built. And it's relationships that I sort of talked about at the beginning of this presentation, and also relationships that come as a result of having those relationships with some of the people I named. And those relationships are not sort of things that you develop in a quick way. It's not, by going to a conference that you develop a relationship with an Indigenous community or an Indigenous language activist, it requires sustained commitment. So repeated moments of showing who you are and showing up. A willingness to listen, I think, goes a really long way. A commitment to giving your time, all that boring stuff that goes along with, you know, the committee work, or, you know, even just things like reviewing grant applications for, and not reviewing in a adjudication type way, like supporting communities when they write grants. All of those things help you to establish a reputation as someone who understands the responsibilities that come along with relationship buildings. Because once you develop relationships, you have then responsibility to those people. So the relationship is not something that comes without sustained work, because once you have a relationship, you have a responsibility to that individual or that community, and that is lifelong. And you also have a responsibility to not exploit those relationships, and that's something that I think happens in Canadian universities a lot. Indigenous faculty members and students get asked a lot in universities to be on committees, to consult in all sorts of ways, plus they have the responsibilities to their own communities, and it can lead to a lot of additional burden that maybe non-Indigenous faculty members and students don't have to deal with. So that means that I keep it in my mind that I can't exploit those relationships that I have, because of the relationships, my friends, my colleagues tend to say yes to me when I ask for things. So I am mindful of that they will say yes to me, they will show up for me. And so I try not to ask unless I really need the help. So I guess to sum up, relationship building takes time, and it also takes sustained effort, and it comes with responsibilities. I want to talk a little bit about some ethical matters. So as I've stepped into supporting Indigenous language activists in their work, it seems like there is a rush to position me as authority. And I think that's maybe a desire, or habitus is maybe another word, to position settler academics as experts or authority. It happens over and over again. I actually have to work against being seen as somebody with expertise. I am offered, oftentimes I get a lot of media requests to give interviews with CBC, other media sources as well. I turn down a lot, or usually what I do is I turn them towards Indigenous experts. But there seems to be a real quickness to position me as expert, even though I state over and over again that that's not, I don't claim any expertise in this subject area. And that also extends to things like publications, invitations to write, to present, to apply for funding. I have to work against taking those opportunities away from Indigenous people. And that's an ethical issue that I sort of grapple with. How do I best do that? How do I redirect? How do I point out what's happening? And instead I try to push towards creating opportunities. And again, that's part of the responsibility that I have, because I am working in relation with Indigenous institutions and communities and peoples. I have this responsibility to create opportunities. So some of the things that I do, and I do these things in collaboration. It's never me on my own. I try to create opportunities for publications. I try to write with Indigenous scholars and give them first author positions. It's not me to give, but we collectively decide that the expertise and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous language means that those people are contributing more than I am. And so usually my Indigenous colleagues are ahead of me in the publication list, because that kind of order seems to matter still in academia. So then we try to leverage that for the benefit of the Indigenous scholars that I work with. We also do things like we have a journal issue coming out with my faculty's journal, and it's a journal issue that is all Indigenous graduate students publishing for the first time their journal articles, and we are pairing them with Indigenous peer reviewers and doing it in an open review process to try to mentor them more through the publishing experience. That's really important. I don't know if how many of you pay attention, but there are searches at most universities every year for professors in the area of Indigenous language revitalization. Oftentimes those searches fail. There aren't enough Indigenous language researchers who work in the area of Indigenous languages. And one of the ways that universities can open up space for Indigenous language activists is by supporting Indigenous graduate students. So creating things like opportunities for publishing are really important, for mentored experiences, for conferences, grants, scholarships, sharing your own research dollars. These are all steps that can go quite a long way to supporting Indigenous graduate students. So those are just some of the things that I have tried. I think it's important for those of us working in universities to speak out in support of Indigenous knowledges. And that may require, as Martha explains, changing some of our epistemological practices. And that means if we need to acknowledge things like the complicity with white supremacy and colonization that universities are involved in. And it means that we have to speak out. And, you know, I put this article in particular on the screen. This is a recent book chapter that, again, I wrote with Belinda and a couple others. Peter Turner's in this one, Dorothy Thunder, Randy Morin, Bill Cook. And this is an article about Indigenous languages and Indigenous knowledges. And in the article, we talk about things like Indigenous research methodologies and keeping dream journals and ceremony and prayer and smudging and visiting as part of research. And we talk about in the article that we want to speak out in support of those practices as research practices. We're not the only voices saying this, but I think I just want to point out that sometimes it requires a bit of shift, and it may not always be accepted by peers in universities when we say that this is what knowledge is, this is what research methods are. And it's really important in my experience, it's been really important as oftentimes the settler co-writer. It's really important for me to say this is legitimate, this matters, and this is not metaphor when we talk about the language having spirit. I try to speak out and amplify the voices of my co-authors, because that's part of creating space, is acknowledging that Indigenous knowledges are legitimate and they are not substandard to Western knowledges that are often prevalent in universities. Okay, this is another area, and I feel a little uncertain about talking about this one, but I think that most of the relationships that I have developed that have allowed me to be sort of at all effective in creating spaces for Indigenous language activists in universities, it's come through my own language learning experiences. And I think part of the reason why I'm a little feeling cautious about talking about this right now is I'm currently working on a research project with Belinda Daniels and Melanie Bryce and Russ Fayant and Andrea Custer and Tammy Ratt. And we're talking about non-Indigenous learners of Indigenous languages and the experiences of Indigenous learners when non-Indigenous language learners are in the same spaces. So I'm not sure that I'm saying everybody should go out and learn an Indigenous language. We're trying to come to some sort of idea of what the protocols or guidelines might be around being a non-Indigenous learner of Indigenous languages. And I don't know that we're going to really arrive at any answers, but we are thinking about it. And so that thinking and writing is making me feel a little nervous about saying that non-Indigenous folks should be learning Indigenous languages. Maybe not right at this moment. I know it's a different context in places like New Zealand where there are many non-Indigenous folks who are learning Indigenous languages. And I think what I've learned from people like maybe Onawa McIvor has written about this, it tends to depend a lot on the vitality of the language in question. And so, you know, a language like Cree maybe has more speakers, more opportunities for learning the language. And so perhaps non-Indigenous folks aren't taking up space. Whereas, you know, a language like Michif or some of the smaller languages in British Columbia, there aren't resources and spaces for learning those languages. So maybe the timing is not quite right. Anyway, that's a lot of preamble to say that I have learned Indigenous languages. So I've been taking a BA in Cree from First Nations University for over 10 years. I just do a class or two at a time. And I'm minoring now in Anishinaabe-Moin. And those experiences of taking classes at First Nations University are probably one of the places that really opened the door for me in terms of becoming a better colleague to Indigenous language activists at the university. So that's how I first met some of my graduate students that I supervise or have supervised. It's where I met other professors who then referred future grad students towards me. I got involved with being examiners or committee members through those relationships that I developed over time. And then those relationships sort of snowballed me towards other organizations and communities. So I think some of the reasons why I wanted to just caution about this topic is that because I've been doing this reading on this project with Belinda and the others, we've been doing a lot of lit review and thinking about it. But I think that sometimes some non-Indigenous folks learn Indigenous languages as a way to sort of absolve ourselves of responsibility for colonial violence. And so that, I think, is the thing that I would caution against, that learning an Indigenous language as a non-Indigenous person is not, it can't be part of that desire for innocence, that move towards innocence that Tuck and Wang talk about. It doesn't absolve you from your involvement in settler colonial violence. And so I think that just needs to be sort of stated up front. And I think that's one of the things that's going to come out of this research project that I'm working on with the others. But I will say that learning Indigenous languages has really changed how I think it's changed me, really. It's changed how I think about learning and being in a group and how I position myself. So it's been a really wonderful experience for me. But it's just one that I think people have to think carefully about because it's an ethical question. It's an ethical dilemma. Okay, there are people with far more expertise than me talking and writing about the relationships between Indigenous communities and universities. And here are some places that you could find more information. So Indigenous Peoples Health Research Center is center located in Saskatchewan. They have space in First Nations University at the U of S and the U of R. And they offer training modules. This one, building research relationships with Indigenous communities, they have created it as a virtual module now. It's a really, really good introduction to thinking about how to be a good university person in relation to Indigenous communities. So I've taken that one and I really like it. OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession, is another training module. Even if you don't think you're going to do research with Indigenous communities, the principles that you learn about within these training modules are really helpful for thinking about how you want to be in a university setting. They've been really beneficial to me. The Tri-Council policy statement has a chapter that's explicitly about conducting research with Indigenous communities, and it's a really good piece of writing. And then another journal article, this one is quite useful to me, is this, it's called Laying the Groundwork. The citation is there. It sets out parameters for working with Indigenous communities. And I just think that there are places where we can learn more about that relationship and how to work together in non-extractive ways. Mela Sarkar has written a bit about that, about being interventionist, being non-extractive, and these guidelines and training modules are another source of information, another place where people can look. Okay, this is the least sort of conclusion slide that I think I've ever written when I said it was a conclusion, because I don't really have conclusions or answers, but these are just some of the things that I have tried to do to make space for Indigenous language activists in universities. And I don't think these are the only answers or the best answers. They're just some things that I've tried, and maybe there are some ideas here that make you think of something in your context. So I hope that's the case. And there's also, I wanted to just state that there's risk here, despite my best intentions. Even the way I framed the presentation seems to suggest that I am someone who can open and close doors at universities. And in some contexts, maybe I can, but I would rather the doors just be gone, basically, instead of the doors, relying on me to be the one to open or close them. So I could have maybe called this presentation, how to open up space for, or creating spaces in universities for Indigenous language activists without stepping into those spaces yourself. I'm not sure if my title's even the best, but I guess I just want to conclude with, settler colonialism has been shaping what we currently call Canada for a really long time. And that's the water that we swim in, and it's hard to shake it off. So the roles oftentimes are really ingrained, and we just need to sort of proceed with caution so that more harm is not done. And here are all my references. And I see that people are saying, yeah, you can certainly put a recording up, it's fine. Yep. Okay, and I will end there and stop sharing. And there's probably some time for questions, I think.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Andrea. That's great. Are there maybe I should ask Francis if he wants to say something first about the EducLang group.
Sure. Well, I'm going to say it now, yes. I wanted to say it after the lead acknowledgement, but I can do it now. Well, I just wanted to, first I would like to thank Andrea for this great presentation, and I look forward to the questioning and the discussing part afterward. I just wanted to welcome everybody on behalf of the EducLang group, Education and Language, and to whom I have the privilege of being the chair, but also collaborating with a great group of colleagues, and Carole Fleuret, Joël Thibault, Mimi Mason, and Douglas Fleming, and Stephanie Arnott. So the group, overall, our mandate is to promote the research in secondary education, Canadian research, but also international research. And part of his mandate, as part of his mandate, we organize different events and seminars, including this one. Before the COVID, we used to also organize a conference, and we hope to do that to resume the EducLang conferences soon. If you want to have more information about our activities or research, etc., we invite you to visit our website, www.educlang.ca. And on this website, you can also find contact information if you want to talk to us more directly. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks, Francis. I'll put the link for the EducLang website up in the chat in just a few minutes. I'll grab hold of it. But in the meantime, we do have a couple of people who would like to ask questions and make comments. And the first is Carol. Please go ahead, Carol.
Je vais te le dire, je pourrais le dire en anglais, mais je vais te le dire en français parce que je pense que c'est... Je veux vraiment que ça soit bien compris. D'abord, merci. Merci, Andrea, pour ta présentation. J'ai adoré. Et le mot n'est pas trop faible. Pour plein de raisons. D'abord, parce que j'aime cette humilité qui t'habite, parce que c'est ça pour moi, faire de la recherche. C'est pas arriver puis faire un show-off. C'est toujours se dire, je sais pas, peut-être que j'ai pas de réponse, je réfléchis. Ça, je pense que malheureusement, c'est de moins en moins présent chez les chercheurs et ça, je voulais vraiment mettre l'accent là-dessus parce que je trouve que c'est absolument c'est important. J'aime aussi la façon dont tu laisses les gens porter leur voix et se faire écouter et se laisser écouter. La voix dont tu places tout le monde au même niveau. Tu n'es pas, comme tu dis, l'expert et les autres après. Je pense que c'est une leçon d'humilité. Puis vraiment, je voulais souligner ça parce que je trouve que c'est vraiment fascinant. Et surtout, puis maintenant, par rapport vraiment plus à l'aspect socio-linguistique, j'aime vraiment beaucoup la façon dont... justement, dont tu questionnes les institutions et puis cet espace et de quelle façon il faudrait effectivement laisser cet espace. Je vais juste faire une parenthèse qui n'appartient qu'à moi. On en parlait un petit peu au début. Depuis la commission, en fait, on annonce toujours que ouais, Ottawa, on est sur un territoire non cédé, blablabla. L'idée sur le fond est noble, mais moi, ça ne me parle pas. Ça ne me parle pas parce que je me dis qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire d'autre concrètement pour reconnaître qu'il n'est pas cédé ce territoire, plus que comme une démarche politique. Qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire? Par exemple, on pourrait donner une taxe foncière à tous ces gens à qui on a pris leurs terres pour leur permettre d'avoir des belles maisons avec de l'eau courante et de l'électricité. Il me semble qu'on pourrait faire quelque chose comme ça. Tu vois, bon, en tout cas, je ne suis pas là pour faire une vendetta, mais pour moi, ça me parle. Et c'est pour ça que ta présentation, elle m'évoque beaucoup parce que si on veut vraiment aller de l'avant dans une perspective de réconciliation, eh bien, c'est par des actions comme les tiennes qu'on va le faire. Ce n'est pas simplement en disant qu'on est sur un territoire non cédé, du moins il me semble. Puis, avec la recherche de Nancy, j'ai énormément aussi appris. Et comme tu l'as dit au début, arriver pour travailler avec les communautés, ce n'est pas bonjour, bonsoir, il faut du temps. On les a stigmatisés, on les a traumatisés, on les a évincés pour prendre un territoire et ça prend du temps. Elle aussi, ça lui a pris quasi 1 an et demi pour pouvoir travailler auprès de la communauté, même si elle est algonquine par sa mère. Donc, j'aime ce respect que tu as. Et voilà, je vais m'arrêter là parce qu'on pourra en parler des heures. Alors, mais je te remercie, Andrea, vraiment. J'ai énormément aimé ta présentation.
Oh, merci, Carole. C'est gentil.
Oui. Floor is open. Please jump in.
Mela's trying to unmute herself. Are you there, Mela?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Wow, okay, because it still says I'm in safe driving mode. I was in safe walking mode, but the phone doesn't know how to distinguish. So Andrea, I was so terrified that you didn't mention me, and then you did, and I was going, oh no, because I don't know anything. I don't know anything. I mean, the work you're doing, what you're doing has been is a model for me. You probably don't want to be a model for anybody, but you are for me. But I wanted to sort of say somehow that what maybe people don't, at least you're gonna have to see what if you no, this is Mela Sarkar, I'm at McGill, and Andrea and I are friends and work together and we'll continue to work together on other things. But when you kind of get your head around the extent of the violence that was done and is still being done, it's so massive. It's so hard to understand. It's so like awful, right? That once you kind of get depressed and give up, and then you come back and go, okay, well, what can I do? But I think it's really important to realize that nothing can undo the effects of the violence that was done. It is irremediable, and reconciliation is kind of a nice word that we kind of trot around, but it mostly means that if you're Indigenous, you decide that you're going to kind of overlook some stuff that you wish you didn't have to, I think. And I always feel funny about land acknowledgements because it's basically we're on stolen land, like, end of story. Anyway, but Andrea, so at the beginning when you said, you say yes to all these things and that it was important to say yes to all these things, and I really wanted you to say what you said no to. No. Because right, because we get so many demands, and then you did start to say a few of the things you said no to, but I don't know if that's something you want to expand on at all. That like trying to basically it's like do as little harm as possible and get out of the way. Is all I know how to do, and I'm trying to do that and trying to be helpful to the Indigenous graduate students that I'm fortunate enough to be supervising. But what do you have to say no to because of the things you have to say yes to? And now I'm going to press the button that says done speaking. It still thinks I'm driving, although I'm not.
Okay, you're muted, Mela. What do I say no to? Okay, I say no to media requests a lot. Nobody needs my voice in the Globe and Mail talking about anything related to Indigenous languages or Indigenous anything. I get offered things like, will you come to Ottawa and present to these government officials? And I say no. And then they say, please come. And I say, okay, you have to pay my way and pay the way of my Indigenous colleague. And that person's name needs to be first on the program. I just get asked to be expert. And I just think it's palatable. It's just palatable to hear things from me more than maybe it is, even though my friends will say the same thing. And oftentimes, like, they'll be kinder almost. But there's some sort of desire to, I don't know, have the white lady say it, maybe the desire, because that legitimizes it. Publication opportunities, usually just what I try to do is subvert them. If I am approached, I say, I'm not the right person, here's the person who is. And sometimes, or I say, I'll do it with that author. Those are some things that and in the university setting, the university, I've taken on roles a few times as dean or as associate dean. And I know, Doug, you said you have no ambitions. Neither do I. I have a hard time saying no to people. That's how I have gotten into those roles. But in those roles, you can do a lot. You can put your elbows kind of out and play a bit defensive. So I guess I've said yes sometimes to those admin roles, and I've tried to make changes in those spaces, but sometimes that's been tricky. This is being recorded, but I'll just share an anecdote and try to say it without naming names. When I was in my acting dean role, we created a policy in the faculty for recruitment and retention of Indigenous faculty members, because we were seeing a lot of turnover. Indigenous colleagues arriving and just sort of spending a year or two and saying, what is this? This is not for me. So we created a policy, and the policy just has different ways. There's finances is part of it, course releases, some money, not just for, you know, research, but money to support research grad students, or it's quite a flexible policy document. Anyway, that was met with some resistance in certain levels of the university. And it was an area that I had to be strategic. Like, I had to push and find sort of allies within the other deans of the other faculties, you know, it's like that sort of hallway texting that you do with other people and say, look, I need you to support this. This is why it's important. So yeah, there are sometimes things that I have to say no to, and there are also sometimes where I have to say yes more than I like to, like these dean roles or associate dean roles that I've taken on.
Great. Andrea, I don't know if you see, there's a question from Joelle in the chat.
Crois-tu que tu trouves face aux langues autochtones?
Ben, ton rôle dans les, je sais que à l'Université de Regina, tu œuvres parfois dans les programmes en français, tu œuvres parfois dans les programmes en anglais, tu as des relations un peu de part et d'autre dans les communautés francophones. Je me demandais finalement si tu envisageais ton rôle, tes rôles, de la même façon si tu travailles en français. Je sais que ma question est très vague parce que je ne sais pas comment la préciser. Fait que tout ce qui pourrait te venir à l'esprit spontanément fera grandement mon affaire.
Yeah. Okay, so when I have worked on things related to Indigenous languages through the medium of the French language, and Carole, you will know this from working with Nancy, there are not always as many Indigenous language activists working through the medium of the French language. And so then sometimes what you find is more settler voices in those contexts. You know, so there is a book that I wrote with, that I co-edited with some colleagues on the topic of treaty education in French. It's a book that's written in French. We had to work really hard to find Indigenous folks who were able to publish in French. We paid for translating a lot in that book, and we set parameters about things like for the chapter contributors, things like privileging Indigenous authors and the citation practices. And I think in those spaces when I work in French, because I consult with my friends. Like, I talk to my friend Russ a lot, and I'll say, Russ, look, this book has a lot of settler voices in it, but I think it's an important point. And you know, he guides me a little bit, I guess. So maybe I take up a bit more space when I work in French. I don't know. I'm trying to establish relationships more with Indigenous language activists who work in French, but I don't know as many. There's going to be a panel on indigenization of teacher education in French at l'ACFA in May. It's online. So I think Nancy is going to be the keynote for those 2 days of Table Ronde.
Yes.
Yeah. So Joelle, I don't really know. I think maybe I am more present sometimes in French than I would like to be, just because there are maybe, like, for example, in Saskatchewan, where there aren't a lot of Francophone voices who are Indigenous, maybe I sometimes step into those spaces just because I might have something to share, but it's usually I'm invited, I think about it very carefully, and I consult with Indigenous folks, and then I try to use the bit of language skill I have in French in those spaces.
Merci beaucoup.
I don't know where, are there other questions there?
Well, see, now I've got one, Andrea. In your PowerPoint, you use the term accomplice.
Yeah.
Can you describe to me that? And I think I understand that you're making a differentiation between an accomplice and an ally. The reason I'm asking this is because I watched some of the news conferences that the Métis leaders were giving in when they met with the Pope in Rome not too long ago. And I was struck by how they made a number of distinctions, certainly in terms of terminology. And I'm sure they were talking specifically about the difference between allies and accomplices. But I was wondering if you could just talk about your perception.
Yeah. So that word, my friend and co-author Peter Turner, he is Cree from James Smith Cree Nation here in Saskatchewan. He's a teacher and a PhD student. He is the one who started using that term when we would write together. And he would say, you know, don't call yourself an ally, call yourself an accomplice. And the idea is, for him, the way he explained it is, sometimes we are transgressing norms, we are breaking rules, and you are our accomplice in those acts of resistance. And it's, you know, I don't call myself those things necessarily. I've never used the word ally for myself. I don't name myself accomplice. You know, if somebody else uses those words for me, that's fine. I don't reject them. I just don't think it's up to me as a white lady, as a white settler lady, to take those on. But that is why in some of the writing that I do with Peter, he thinks that that's a good term to use, because I think what he's trying to point to the fact is that we are transgressing norms, that we are resisting, and that I am the accomplice in that work.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, it goes back to some comments I've heard lately. You know, we cannot claim these things for ourselves, right? We can't claim to be allies. I mean, who provides those terms, right? We're not going to give ourselves these honoraria without without merit. Certainly.
Yeah. I mean, they call me lots of things. Like, there, you know, humor is kind of pervasive throughout our writing. And we actually include, when we write about our research methodology, we include humor as part of our research methodology. And that has to do with this idea of, well, it's a concept that I first read about. Leroy Littlebear is somebody from University of Lethbridge. He is Blackfoot. And he writes about the idea of sharing good feelings between people as a way to develop relationships and have strong relationships. So that teasing is really a part of the research that I've done with particularly my Cree friends. And they often call me Kayaswias because, and that means, if any of you speak Cree, it means long ago meet. Because one time in a conversation we were having in Cree, and my Cree is really like not great. I was trying to explain that I don't eat meat currently, which is a source of like a lot of teasing with my friends who, you know, hunt regularly. They harvest off the land. And so I was saying, long ago I ate meat, but now I don't eat meat. So sometimes they say they want me to be named Kayaswias in our publications. They think that's hilarious. Basically, it's the vegetarian white lady who doesn't eat meat is what they call me.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, no one else has a question. I have another question about terminology that comes to me because I was struck by a few things that these Métis leaders were saying. And one of them was expressing a lot of anger around what he called, what they called, I'm not too sure. But anyway, what they called the reconciliation industry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with that. Could you comment? I mean, I'm assuming it's not something that we want to promulgate. But.
Yeah. I mean, it's a topic, and Joelle could probably talk about this too. It's certainly a topic in university settings where, you know, the survivors of residential schools gave us those calls to action, and they're really good calls to action. And I try to listen to those. I try to listen to UNDRIP. Like, there are places to look for guidance. And then it's like universities took those documents and said, haha, we're going to do it our way, and created new roles, you know, like oh, I don't know, they look like different things in different contexts. And thankfully, you know, a lot of the Indigenous leads have seemed to be Indigenous folk, but in some cases there are reconciliation leads or chairs in different units on campus. Basically, it's created jobs and opportunities for settler people to talk about things. And so I think that's the whole industry that they are referring to, is the way it's created jobs instead of created the changes that the survivors were hoping for. And jobs for non-Indigenous folk is what I mean.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Floor is open. Comments, questions?
Hi there, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So just a little bit about the project that you're working on with non-Indigenous language learners. One of the things that really struck me a little while ago in speaking with Indigenous scholar from the University of Victoria, and it was not Belinda, but she talked about the trauma that is a part of language learning for many Indigenous people. And that's, of course, something that non-Indigenous learners, it's not even on the horizon. And it's something that, you know, I've never thought about as a learner of Spanish or French or English. So I wonder if that's something that is part of, that comes up in your project?
It's probably the reason we started the project, because trauma is such a part of that language reclamation process. And it's not my place to sort of talk about the experiences of the other learners that are around me. But I don't have those memories or feelings, that trauma associated with the language learning. And so the experience feels really different for me because I am just approaching it as a language learning exercise, whereas Indigenous classmates or participants in Indigenous language programs are processing trauma as they reliving trauma as they learn the language or try to learn the language. But the trauma is oftentimes an obstacle in that learning process. There's so much grief. They often talk about it physically, like it's in my throat. There's something in my throat as I speak. And so then, because they have those experiences impacting their language learning, and I'm sailing merrily along, conjugating verbs and memorizing them, it looks like I am a better student. And that is reinforcing like the shame that they are feeling. And so that's kind of why we set out to even talk about the idea. Should that grief and trauma be witnessed by Indigenous folks, or non-Indigenous folks, or should there be protected spaces so that all of that emotional aspect that goes along with the language reclamation is not, doesn't have to be paraded past the non-Indigenous student. So that's sort of where that's one of the things we are talking about. And, you know, we're mindful that there's some structures in place that would prevent that kind of separation, like maybe university settings where they are credit classes. It might be difficult to say only Indigenous folk in this class, but you know, they do sections of things for other programs. So there might be ways to create some sections, or maybe it's through the grassroots community projects where the leaders of those programs, like Belinda's camps are by invitation now, because of these sorts of things. I don't think that we have the answers, and we're not trying to come up with like rules, but we want to think about it together, because there are example after example after example that people talk about. And so there seems to be some benefit to us discussing it and writing about it a bit more.
I remember I took a course from Roger Simon at OISE years ago, and he did separate, it was a graduate course, he did separate people as they wished into different groups. And it was according to gender and sexual preference. Now, I'm not sure he handled it all that well, to be honest. there were a lot of challenges, but kudos to, I mean, he's gone now, but kudos to him for doing that quite a few more years ago than I would like to admit. But you know, there seems to be some room for that. It's certainly, I don't think anybody in our institution would have too many problems with that. Maybe I'm wrong.
That's Belinda's project, that one. I am just a participant in it, but I'm sure you'll see Belinda talking about it more in publications and conferences.
Well, the floor is open. Comments, questions, please. Well, maybe we've reached the magic hour of 5 o'clock. People have to go, I'm sure. So thank you so very much, Andrea. I mean, I don't know if Francis wants to say a few final words on behalf of the group, but it's been wonderful having you here. And as I said, I'll, with your permission, I'll post the recording on the EducLang website as soon as we can get that tech stuff together. But Francis, did you want to say something?
Sure, thank you, Doug. Well, I just wanted to once again thanks Andrea for this great presentation on behalf of the group, and I'm sure on behalf of all of the people who attended the presentation. I think that it was a great learning experience. As myself, I am currently also learning a little bit more about the ontoepistemology of indigenous ontoepistemologies and learning about it. So I think it was, I do agree with some of the things that you said about how it's important to also to create space where such understanding of the world are also welcome. So thank you for this, and I also would like to thank the participants and the audience for coming here today, for the great questions and comments. As I said earlier, please visit our websites for more information about upcoming seminars. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, I think I'm going to go. I have a Canadian Tire order to pick up.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say thank you again. And I will see you
there's a big lake in
soon.
my backyard, and I have to pump out the water, so I have to go pick up my submersible pump.
Okay.
Oh.
I will see you soon with Nancy's defense.
Oh, ik sluit laat. Oh, oui.